Welcome to our tutorial about using databases. In this tutorial, we're going to implement a simple SQL database. You'll see how easy it is to work with ADO.NET technology. You might be surprised to learn that a lot can be done without much programming skill at all. Before we start, I'm going to talk about the specifics of running a database on a web application. Even programmers who've been working with desktop databases for a while can experience difficulties when they migrate to web applications. The two main issues are problems of scale and problems of state. The problem of scale. If you compare desktop applications to web applications, you've got a single user at any given time with access to your application. The scale of a web application is generally much larger. You might have hundreds, even thousands of simultaneous viewers on your application. This means that you've got to be very cautious about using server memory and other such limited resources. Data connection, for example. If you don't consider database concurrency issues when changes from different users overlap, you can also end up with data inconsistency, so this is yet another consideration that you'll need to keep in mind when working on a web application. Another problem that I mentioned before is the problem of state. The problem of state comes from the disconnected nature of the Internet. HTTP is a stateless protocol to begin with. When a user requests a page from ASP.NET, the web server processes the code and returns rendered HTML, and then it closes the connection right away. As a result, you end up with an application that's not running continuously, as with a desktop application, but in reality, it's just receiving static pages. Because of this, web applications have to perform all the work during a single request. They connect to the database, they read the information, display it, and then close the database connection. This causes difficulties if the user needs to modify retrieved information. And that's the bad news. The good news, on the other hand, is that both ASP.NET and ADO.NET were designed to address exactly these problems. This tutorial is based on the assumption that you've got some basic understanding of databases. Some of the concepts you need under your belt are structure, relationships, and so on. If you're not familiar with these basic concepts, please review the database-related topics earlier in this course. Let's begin by inserting an SQL database into our project. Add new item. Let's select SQL Server Database, Language, VB. Let's change the database name to Users. For simplicity, this database will only contain 3 fields: first name, last name, and email address. Click Add. Now Visual Studio asks me if I want to place my data file in the app_data folder. Let's click Yes. And as you see, our database is now available in the Server Explorer. Let's right-click on Tables and select Add New Table. I'm going to quickly create this table. If you're not familiar with this process, please see our chapters on this topic earlier in this course. Okay, here's my user ID column. I won't allow any null values. My next field will be first name, the data type, varchar 50, and my third column will be last name, same data type, varchar 50, email, again, same data type. And we won't allow any of these fields to contain null data. The first column, user ID, is my primary key. Let's change the identity specification to yes. And select the Save Primary Key button. Now let's save our table as users. Type in the name and click OK. Here's our table and our columns. And we've finished creating our table. Let's close this, back to our code. And let's return to default ASPX. Go to Design View. Let's delete this layer and insert a table. 2 rows and 1 column. Make it 400 pixels wide. Click OK. Now let's expand the toolbox and then pin it down. We're going to scroll down to the data branch. You know what? Let's begin by entering data into our table. Let's right-click and select Show Data Table. First name, Bob. Tab to the next column, Smith. And tab to the email column, bob@test.com. Next line, Tom. Last name Lee. And email address tom@lee.com. Let's enter one more row. Adam, first name. Last name Abba. And let's close our table. Now return to the Toolbox data branch and select a SQL data source. Let's drag and drop it in. Select Configure Data Source. Now let's select our database. Users. Here's our connection string. The connection string is an instruction for ADO.NET regarding how to access our database. Click Next. Now we've got the option to save this connection in the application configuration file. That means this data will be saved in the web.config file. If we need to modify it later, we easily can. And let's click Next. Here we have options regarding how we'd like to retrieve data from our database. I'm going to select all the columns by checking here. Below is the Select statement. Let's click Next. Here we can test our query to see how the data we'll be retrieving looks. Looks good? Let's click Finish. And click outside to deselect everything. From the Toolbox's data branch, grab and drop Grid View right here. Data Source. We'll choose our SQL data source. Here's a preview of what our data looks like. Let's click Debug. Oh, we've got a problem. Let's go find my mistake. Let's close this. I think I know what the problem is here. I'm going to right-click and select Set as Start Page. And let's run it again. The page loads. Okay, much better. This is a very simple example about how to create and display data in a web browser. See how much we did without even writing a single line of code? As you can see, Visual Studio provides you with a whole bunch of tools for increasing your efficiency and productivity. This concludes our tutorial about using a database.